Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you coming to our workshop. I think we're going to start with a little bit of introductions. I'm Jenny Ackley. I work for Vera House, and Vera House is the Domestic and Sexual Violence Agency in Onondaga County, Syracuse area. And my role there is I'm project coordinator for our Abuse in Later Life project there. So I'm going to pass that to
Alette Callahan. I'm the director of the Elder Transitions Mediation Program at New Justice Conflict Resolution Services, which is the Community Dispute Resolution Center under New York State's Court Administration for Onondaga, Oswego, and Cortland counties.
My name is Sarah Rekas. I'm the director at the Center for Court Innovation's Upstate office located in Syracuse, New York. And we run a restorative justice practice called Peacemaking that diverts cases out of the criminal justice system and the family court system back into the community for resolution. We also run a peacemaking project in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and are about to launch one in the Bronx.
My name is Melanie Carden. I'm a senior assistant district attorney with the Onondaga County District Attorney's Office. Currently, I run the Economic Fraud and Rackets Bureau, where we deal with prosecution of elder financial exploitation cases. And then previously, I was in the Special Victims Bureau, which is where we deal with elder physical violence and sexual violence cases.
I'm Barry Beck. I'm a Deputy Commissioner for Onondaga County Adult and Long-Term Care Services. I'm primarily responsible for Adult Protective Services, the county's single point of access for severely mentally ill people, and the Assisted Outpatient Treatment Program.
Hey, great. How many of you here from Adult Protective Services? A lot of you. Okay, Office for Aging? Okay, Domestic and Sexual Violence Agencies? What didn't I call? DA's office, okay. Attorney. Others, great, great. Well, thanks for being here. We're going to get a little bit into the detail behind what is restorative practices and when it might be utilized. I kind of wanted to start with a little bit more information about what's really the dynamics around the issue of elder abuse. If you have a population of 300 older adults, what we know in the prevalence study that was cited is 14% of them might experience elder abuse and neglect. Okay, that would be 42 in this. And from there, who reports? 2. 2 of those people out of the 300 actually will come to the attention of authorities. It's a big issue though, 42 were impacted. And let's make that a little bit worse. If we start looking at older adults with dementia, half of them experience some form of elder abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And if only 1 in 24 reports, out of 150, you might hear about 6 of them. We need to get better about that, and I think we need to talk about why that reporting is not happening. Why aren't we hearing from them, okay? And why, I'm gonna ask you, why don't older people report? Shame? Yeah, shame. There's a lot of shame that goes on. Did I cause this? What else?
Denial.
Denial. What does that mean? Like what? What are they denying?
I can't believe this is happening. It's not real.
Yep.
So it's not going to happen.
Yep.
Even though it is.
Yep, yep. Others?
Fear of being put in the nursing home.
Fear of being put in the nursing home. There's all kinds of fear, right? Fear of the nursing home. What else are they afraid of?
Kind of getting their only caregiver in trouble.
Yep, yep. Who's going to take care of me? Yep. What else?
Fear or love of the abuser.
Yeah, they care about the abuser. Yep, they care about the abuser. There's all kinds of reasons. So fear that it's going to get worse, right? Fear of being abandoned, that came up. The family member came up. Pressure, family pressure. Is there sometimes pressure? Don't tell, right? This is our business. And you're just going to mess up things with the family. We don't want that, right? So sometimes there's family pressure. Social isolation can be a really big aspect on why people don't report as well. We're hearing more and more about social isolation. And sometimes they just don't even know the resources that are out there. So we need to get over some of those hurdles, right? Why don't they? Fear of retaliation, shame, they don't want their loved one to get into trouble. That's some of the reasons. I'm going to pass it off because there's other reasons. APS?
That's all right, I have one slide. Hi. So Adult Protective Services is one of the major points of contact We get about, in Onondaga County, we get about 1,400 referrals a year. We end up taking about 3/4 of those. So when someone sees something, as Jenny described in the previous slide, why don't we take every case? Well, we have some specific criteria that has some leeway in it, but it's, you have to be over 18, you have to be an adult. You have to have a mental or physical limitation. It doesn't have to be diagnosable, it doesn't have to be severe mental illness, it doesn't have to be a severe physical condition, but you have to meet one of those, not both. And the risk of someone being vulnerable, at risk for something to happen, such as self-neglect, neglect by others, not taking care of yourself appropriately. You have to meet that criteria. The last one is no one willing or able to appropriately assist the individual. And I put the stress on appropriately because there are many people, such as abusers, who would be more than happy to keep taking care of the individual, but they may be stealing their money, they may be abusing them, in every way imaginable. So that's our main limitation, is if they don't meet criteria, we will try to refer them to another agency, we'll try to assist them, but we won't be taking them on in adult protective. The second one, which we could probably spend a whole workshop on, is self-determination and competency, because everybody has their own idea of what that means. In my mental health world, it's, are you a threat to self or others? Are you an imminent threat to self or others? In that case, that starts a whole new batch of things that can happen to you, such as being picked up by the police and taken to your local emergency room or your local psychiatric emergency room. But in the vast majority of cases, people are making decisions that we would think are not right, that are harmful to them, but if they have competency and we determine that, they have a right to self-determination. They have their civil rights, unless we're the guardian and their civil rights have been taken away, or they've been committed to a hospital or whatever. They have the right to make decisions that we think are bad and may actually be harmful. So we can't force them, and that's probably the biggest misnomer that referral entities have, is they think we can just come in and fix everything as adult protective, and we can't always do that. When we are involved and we want to look at, I'll use financial exploitation for the example, what happens is they often want the exploitation to stop, but they don't want the perpetrator to be punished in the sense of going to jail, being prosecuted, being arrested even. It's usually a family member, 95% of the cases, a family member, someone known to them, an intimate partner. So they don't want them to go to jail, they don't want them to be prosecuted, but they don't want all their money disappearing either. So we have quite a challenge with that, which is why we're doing this workshop. The viable options part is adult protective is mandated to report financial exploitation to law enforcement, and we do that, but law enforcement, as you'll find out in the next slide when Melanie comes in, is they have their limitations too. So our options are we refer to law enforcement, and that's about it currently. If law enforcement does not prosecute, does not find enough evidence to pursue it, we're kind of stuck. We could become rep payee, we can become guardian of the person, and we could stop future financial exploitation. But there's really nothing we can do as adult protective about prior financial exploitation or what's happened. But they can. So, Melanie.
Click it for me?
I clicked it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what makes these cases difficult to prosecute when they are referred to us. So Barry talked a lot about self-determination, and we encounter the same thing in the sense that people call us up, there's been financial exploitation, there's been some sort of abuse, and the answer that they give us is, okay, but we don't want to press charges. Or alternatively, there's been an arrest made, and we get the call that, okay, I understand that the arrest was made, but now I want to drop the charges. What we have to balance, essentially, and the difficult role that we're in as the prosecutors, is having that conversation with somebody who's been victimized and saying, okay, that's all well and good. Unfortunately, it's not your choice. And so it's really saying to somebody that you have given up that control. It's no longer your decision. You don't get to drop the charges. We have to act basically in consistently meeting the ends of justice. So that means it's the state, the people of the state of New York versus John Doe, not you, Ms. Doe, versus John Doe or Mr. Doe or whatever. So it's a balancing act, it really is. And in some cases, you know, we have the power to compel people to testify. We have the ability to get material witness warrants, which means that we can actually put somebody into custody until they do testify. It's a pretty draconian measure, and we don't like to necessarily do that. So there's a lot of balancing there, a lot of discretion that we have to exercise and decide whether this is a case that we want to push through, even when the person doesn't necessarily want to prosecute, and if so, how far we're willing to go to actually do that, and how important the case is in terms of going forward on that. The other thing that makes these cases very hard is capacity. So the way that we prosecute these cases, and some of you were in the last presentation, so I apologize you're hearing this for the second time, but the theory on these cases is that you either have theft, and that the person either had the capacity to consent and to give the money, or they didn't. So capacity, and the victim's capacity and the defendant's knowledge of that capacity is really key. Where it becomes very difficult, and unfortunately we've encountered this more times than I'd like to admit, is where you have a case where there was some sort of theft and the person actually, the victim had capacity at that point. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they would actually have to testify. They would have to talk about the circumstances of the financial agreement, whether they did give this person the money, whether they didn't give them the money, whether they gave them money but it was because of some sort of lie or coercion or manipulation or whatever. But the key is that if the capacity was there at the time of the taking, the victim has to testify. What becomes very hard is, and particularly with older adults where you know, mental status is changing, physical condition is changing, is where the person had capacity and then their mental condition deteriorates to the point that they no longer do. So you had the theft, you have the expectation that they would have to testify, but now I have a victim who I can't put on the stand, or who no longer remembers, or who can't articulate, and that's unfortunately a case that we probably can't go forward on. And then last, the evidence and the level of evidence that's required in this case is actually voluminous. And sometimes there just, unfortunately, isn't enough. So particularly where the theft has been going on over the course of years, or you have somebody with you know, some degree of mental incapacity or dementia-related illnesses such that they don't have a completely clear recollection of what's going on, but maybe they don't fall under the incapacitated category for the sake of being able to go forward without them, we may not be able to move on it, particularly where the defense on these cases is always going to be, the person gave me money, right? The person gave it to me, they wanted me to have it. So having somebody who's able to articulate that didn't happen, or able to articulate, well, this person was power of attorney, but here's how we decided the money was supposed to be spent. This was the agreement between us. So where, you know, sometimes there's a lack of evidence in that regard, in the sense that we don't have enough, the victim doesn't have enough of a recollection to be able to go forward on it. Other times there's just literally not enough corroboration. So in terms of paper evidence, documentary evidence, other witnesses who are able to corroborate what was going on, there may just not be enough. So there are huge hurdles to going forward. The bright light at the, you know, on this one is that hopefully we're getting better at investigating them and doing a better job and being able to move forward, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an easy job.
Okay, thank you. So in Onondaga County, we've been having this conversation for probably 5 to 7 years now. What do we do with these cases that don't fit what APS can do and what the district attorney's office can prosecute? right? And so we have really dedicated staff in both of these agencies that come to our multidisciplinary team meetings, right? They're there at the table. They want to work together on these cases, many of which are very complicated and time-consuming. And there are some points where you just stop dead in your tracks and you think, okay, well, we've done everything that we can really do, so what's left? What's the alternative? And I think that we're really fortunate because we have a lot of thought leaders who are coming together in Onondaga County to talk about these issues, including the folks from the county, from the DA's office, from Syracuse University, and Alette and myself, and then our big champions, Vera House, to talk about, okay, well, what are some of the alternatives? And so one idea that we have been tossing around and really trying to get our feet wet in and understand better is there an alternative using restorative practices? And so restorative practices is a term that I prefer to use. Most people have heard of the term restorative justice. I think that it actually has a different definition from what we're actually investigating as a theory. But just to give you a little bit of a sense, restorative justice is this theory of justice that's focused on rehabilitation and on holding offenders accountable. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make the harmed party whole, okay? And really understand the victim's needs. And the victim can be defined very broadly in this case. It doesn't just have to be, I'm the one who suffered the financial exploitation, so I'm the victim. We can also think of families as victims, of neighborhoods, of neighbors, right, of communities as being the victims in these cases. So one way to think about it is that we have this traditional court system that has limitations that have been put in place on purpose, right? We didn't just come up with the criminal justice system as it is and think, okay, this is gonna work, and now all the cases have to fit into this box. So there's precedent, right? There's legal precedent for why cases have to meet a certain standard of proof. And sometimes they don't, okay? And so what we try and think about is, so what are our goals with these cases that don't actually fit into the traditional criminal justice model? And so one of the things we like to talk about is it's the questions that we ask that matter for how we move these cases forward. And many of us are trained, and this is for better or for worse, many of us are trained to ask the questions that are on the top, which I'll read to you in case you can't see it in the back. What rules have been broken? What's the law, right? What are the rules that have been broken? The second question is, who did it? And we have to be sure of that. Who is it? And then the third question is, what do they deserve? And those are all valid questions, right? They're good questions. But sometimes our cases don't fit into that model, especially these cases where we have competency issues, where the witness has agreed to some of the financial sharing of the money and not others, right? Where people feel a lot of guilt and shame, where they say, well, oh, I let them into my house. I didn't realize, though, that they were going to do X, Y, and Z. And so the questions that we're beginning to ask as a group are, who has been hurt? And again, this can be broad. It can be more broad than just John Doe, who Melanie talked about before. It can be the adult children, it can be grandchildren, it can be neighbors, it can be a spouse who is maybe in a nursing home or in a rehabilitation facility, right? We can understand that there's multiple levels of harm and it can happen to many people. There are ramifications beyond just the one person. We also want to ask, what are their needs? What do they need out of this? Sometimes a victim needs an apology that's an actual apology. Not, I'm sorry that what I did offended you. That's not an apology, right? We've all heard that one before. That's not acceptable, right? They want a real apology. They want to know that you're not going to do it to somebody else. They want to know that you're going to get the substance abuse treatment or the gambling addiction treatment that you need so that you don't steal from somebody else, right? That's what their need is. Although sometimes what they need is for you to actually pay back the money you took, right? And then what are the harms? What actually was harmed? And I thought that this is a really good question in that sometimes the harm is multifaceted, right? So we can harm people's sense of self. We can harm their ability to function on a day-to-day level without fearing for their safety. Right? There are psychological harms, along with these physical or financial harms. And then the last question is, whose obligation is it to repair the harms? And I think one of the toughest answers to that is sometimes it's collectively us, right? And that's why a lot of people do the work that we do in working with the elder population, is because we feel a sense of justice here, right? That people should be able to be made whole. And so how do we do that, though, when we have a system that doesn't necessarily allow for that? So those are the questions that we are talking about as a team, what's bringing us together as stakeholders. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to talk a little bit about comparing these systems a little more specifically, and then we're going to do a case scenario, which we hope you will be participating in.
So that's a little bit of background on what we're talking about. And I think sometimes you can get involved in a case of elder abuse and exploitation, and you're really mad at that perpetrator, right? How many of you have dealt with these cases? You want them to go to jail, right? Terrible people. You want something bad to happen, and that you have all these barriers. And is that really what that individual wants? Okay, so we're going to kind of break it out a little bit on different types of, we're going to look at prosecution, we're going to look at peacemaking, and we're going to look at mediation as options for these individuals. They may not always want to prosecute. That might not be the best thing for them. So we'll dive into that in a little bit more depth. And Melanie, I'll let you go first, talking about prosecution.
So the goal of criminal prosecution is, I think, really very well defined in the Supreme Court case, and this is Berger versus United States from 1935. And what it says is the prosecutor, so we as the representative of the state of New York, the prosecutor is the representative not of an ordinary party to a controversy, but of a sovereignty, whose interest, therefore, in a criminal prosecution is not that it shall win a case, but that justice shall be done. So I think what we're here talking about today, though, is that there's various definitions of what justice really means, and whether it's criminal justice versus restorative justice, and kind of how that works. So for purposes of the criminal justice system, justice is essentially defined as fairness, as doing the right thing. And the DA's Association of New York actually put out an ethical guideline for prosecutors, which is called The Right Thing, and that says that a guilty verdict serves our client's interests only if the defendant is in fact guilty and has received due process. So our goal here is not only to secure a conviction or to hold somebody responsible, but it's essentially doing so in the right way, and doing so in a way that preserves the rights of the defendant, as well as hopefully getting some sort of closure and justice for the victim as well. So we have to look at not only, and I talked a moment ago about witness reluctance and victim reluctance, we have to look at this from kind of a bird's eye level. So what does it mean as a whole? What does this case mean across the board, and is the disposition essentially consistent with other cases that are similar? So the goal is that you're not necessarily treating people differently or vastly differently, but then there's also kind of an aspect in terms of drilling down and making sure that you are looking at each and every single case individually, and making sure that you're taking the equities and taking the defendant as a singular person, and making sure that the ends are fair and just to that person, as well as on the larger scale across the breadth of the criminal justice system. So long and short of it, like I said, the guideline, it really comes down to, and we kind of joke in our office at least, that our job is you just do the right thing. You get to go to work every day and you do the right thing. That doesn't always necessarily accomplish what Sarah was talking about, which is, though, okay, but where's the harm, who repairs that, and whatnot. So in terms of getting to the next bullet point, the referrals for our cases generally come from law enforcement agencies. They do sometimes also come from other investigative agencies like APS or other ones that have referred it to our attention. But vast majority of the time it comes from law enforcement investigatory agencies. And the last, what is the victim's role? And again, this varies a bit from obviously other restorative practices. So New York State Fair Treatment Standards Law grants crime victims the right to be consulted by the DA's office, the right to know about the defendant's release, know about a pending trial, and also available sentencing alternatives, so consulting them about what the disposition looks like. What you're not hearing there is that the victim gets to control the process, right? So basically what they're guaranteed, and what it's my obligation to do, is make sure that they're informed, and make sure that I'm talking to them, and make sure that I'm understanding where they're coming from and what they want to see happen. And on the flip side of that, my obligation is also that they hopefully understand when I simply can't do that. So the answer sometimes is you have somebody come in and, you know, somebody has taken a couple dollars from them and they want, you know, 25 years in prison. And the conversation in that moment has to be, okay, well, I can't do that, and here's why. It's not consistent, it's not allowed under the penal law, it's not an option. Or, like we talked about earlier, we have people come in who say, you know, this was a lot of money, this was a pretty serious assault, whatever it may be, but I don't want to do anything, I don't want to press charges. And same conversation we have to have, that we can't do that, that's not a decision that's available here, and here's why. So it's both an obligation to consult and to hear what people have to say, and also to hopefully make sure that they're understanding and you know, feel informed throughout the process.
Thanks. So next I'm going to talk about peacemaking. So peacemaking is a Native American informed practice of conflict resolution, and it focuses on using community volunteers, and cases are diverted out of the justice system and back into the community for resolution. And so community members are trained to facilitate these cases. And so the goal here is to reach a consensus decision on how to move forward and how to heal a relationship. Some people come into the process and they're not interested in healing the relationship. They want the apology and then they want to go on their way. And that is their prerogative. It's a victim-driven process, but also an offender-driven process, right? So both participants are treated as equals in the circle. There's no hierarchy within the circle. It is a circle process, so there's no hierarchy within the circle. And that can be really difficult because people look to the community volunteers to settle the case, right? I want you to tell him that he is wrong, right? And that's not really our role. But what we do is we use personal experiences to drive the cases forward. And so there's a lot of storytelling involved and people trying to come to some sort of resolution together. Currently, I work in the Syracuse project, and so that's the one I'm most familiar with. But what we try and do in terms of how our referrals come in is our referrals are diverted from justice system stakeholders, like I mentioned before. So that's, but we get them at all stages of the justice system. So we get cases referred by the police that are pre-arrest. So they get called to a house and they say, rather than arresting, instead I'm going to send you to peacemaking. And then if you don't do anything about it, then I'm going to follow up with the DA's office, right? So sometimes that's enough of a push. We also get referrals directly from the DA's office, from defense attorneys, and from judges. And then we get cases post-sentence. So they've been sentenced or they've received a disposition, and one of the things they've been asked to do is participate in peacemaking. And so the cases come that way. We also get school referrals from mostly middle and high schools around disciplinary proceedings, because those are quasi-judicial proceedings generally. And lastly, we get self-referrals and community walk-ins. And we actually had quite a number of referrals that come from local faith agencies, so churches, mosques, jail ministries, folks like that. And then, like I said earlier, it's a victim-driven process, it tends to be, or a participant-driven process, excuse me. And so part of it is knowing that if your case is before a judge, the judge may or may not take into account what you're doing in peacemaking. But so far in all of the cases we've had, which is about 300 or so in the past 4 years, in all of those cases, the judges have taken into account the work that people are doing in the circle. But one thing they're very careful of is, and that we're very careful of, is that what happens in the circle remains confidential, and it's up to the participants to divulge how much they want to, right? And so the justice system puts a lot of faith and trust into our process and allowing it to remain confidential. Usually people are really proud of the work they do, and so they want to share. And so that's okay, right? But our staff and our volunteers are committed to a confidential process. But there's a knowledge that if we don't do something, if we don't figure this out on our own with these community volunteers, many of whom are our neighbors, helping us out, somebody else is going to make that decision for us. And that goes back to what Melanie just said. Sometimes we don't want the judge to make the decision. We don't want this to go in front of a jury, right? We don't want the DA's office to make the decision on this. We want to be able to solve this issue ourselves, particularly if the person is in the community and has a lot of community support, whether that's extended family, neighbors, friends that they've lived in the neighborhood with for 50 years. You know, they're a member of a faith community and that's really strong and supportive, right? They want to be able to figure out a solution on their own. And lastly, there's often a focus on preventing further escalation. right? And so trying to understand, is this going to go someplace else? And sometimes cases don't go any farther because, particularly in a case where the victim doesn't know the person, right? It's sort of like a one and done, right? Somebody stole your identity, right? And then you never hear from them again. Like that's the Nigerian scam artist, right? Who's getting you to wire money to them to get your grandson out of jail, right? It's targeted, but it's not personal, right? In this process, peacemaking works when people have a relationship and they're invested in the relationship going forward. So that's between neighbors, that's between caregivers, that's between family members and friends.
Thanks. Hi. So the goal of mediation, dispute resolution, like prosecution, like peacemaking, but the goal of mediation is primarily to help the parties solve problems, specific problems. And when they want to, which is often in the context of these cases, when they want to rebuild the relationships among the parties. So our starting point in mediation is always, what are the parties' concerns? And once we understand those concerns, what are the specific issues that arise from those concerns? So in cases like financial exploitation and elder abuse more generally, some of the issues that the parties might want to resolve are, where should the elder live? Are different caregiving arrangements necessary? Harkening back to Melanie and Morgan's presentation just before this, is a power of attorney needed? And if so, who should be the power of attorney? Those kinds of specific questions are really amenable to being addressed through the mediation process. We are not about fact-finding. Our goal is not to figure out who did what or why. It's also not to determine accountability in a moral or ethical sense. I don't mean to suggest that people don't find it cathartic, because many times they do. And they're encouraged each individually to tell their story and their concerns. But our primary purpose, and in fact we're really not equipped to make judgments. We don't make judgments like that. As I said, it's not therapeutic. It's not a substitute for family therapy. In fact, my executive director often says that we should figure out some way of getting a kickback for referrals to family therapy. And I don't mean that literally, of course, but it's not unusual for the family to come to a conclusion at the end of a mediation process that family therapy would be useful to them in moving forward after the decisions have been made. So those are our goals and objectives. In terms of referral, as you see here, a very broad range of referral possibilities. I'm going to talk more about that when we talk about the specific scenario that we're going to discuss today. But one thing I do want to point out here is that, particularly with reference to agencies, to law enforcement, to APS, to the professionals that are listed here, it's not unusual for mediators to be contacted to fill a gap or support services that can be provided by those other agencies and professionals to back them up, in essence. The mediation process is completely participant-driven. We don't use the terms victim, perpetrator, responsible party. We're not about about finding facts or determining who's a bad guy. That's not what we do. This is something that causes a problem, okay? Can cause a problem, certainly. We've had cases referred from APS, and others where everybody except one person in the family will agree to mediation and that person won't agree to participate. If that person is someone who's critical to what's happening, what's causing the conflict, and what's needed to resolve it and move forward and make decisions on these problems, then we can't go forward. So that's a structural challenge always with mediation. But there is a ray of hope. Obviously, this is, it's not the first time we've heard it when we hear those concerns raised, and we can work with parties to try to make everybody comfortable coming to the table. So back to Jenny, I think.
So one of your handouts that you should have summarizes this in kind of a grid. We know we covered a lot, but we figured if we walked through it one at a time, that might kind of be helpful, and then you can kind of compare and contrast them. I'll share a little bit of a quick personal story. We've been talking about restorative practices for quite some time in our community, and I took some online courses and have been trying to learn a little bit more about it and when it might be used. And don't you know, something happened to me personally. I had a theft in my home. And it was, we had gone out to dinner. My husband and I were in and out of the house. We were having repair people in the home, working on our house. And we got back and I'm like, my laptop's gone. Where is my laptop? And I realized that was gone. And we looked around the house and we had a couple of other electronic things that were missing. And we didn't know what happened. And I felt terrible because we had been working with contractors in our house for a long time. And I really liked them. They were like family members, but there was somebody new who had been there. We found a water bottle that looked like it had paint on it. So I thought, oh, it would be awful if it was one of our contractors because I really care about them. They really are like family when you have people working with you. And then I started thinking, but what if it wasn't them? And what we ended up, we called them first and said, is it possible that this is going on? Well, that bubbled up, and then they felt bad about us that we would suspect them. We felt bad even suspecting them. And then it ended up, it was somebody else in the community. The person had drug addiction issues. They actually found my laptop. We didn't get everything else back. But when I personalized this to this, I didn't really want this guy to go to jail. I wanted him to understand, hey, I went through all of this emotional stuff. I didn't feel safe in my own home. We talked about getting a security system, which we had never really talked about before. We felt like we were living in a safe place. So all of a sudden, the idea of the criminal justice system, it's not what was going to work for me. I wanted the guy to get help. I wanted to know why it happened the way it happened. So I think when we talk about restorative practices, it gives other options to people who might have been victimized. So we're going to move on with that through a story. I'm going to say we're running a little bit behind, but I think we're fine because we have time for Q&A. I'm going to let you go.
All right. Greg is 89 years old, and he has a large family, including 5 adult children and 12 adult grandchildren. He lives in the family home along with his granddaughter, Jolie. Greg handles his own financial affairs. Jolie does not pay rent. She does the grocery shopping and the laundry, and she prepares dinner for Greg and herself most nights. Jolie's mother, Anna, cleans the house every couple of weeks. Most of the rest of the children and the grandchildren also live nearby and are frequent visitors to the family home, which is usually the gathering place for family events. Earlier this year, Greg was the victim of identity theft. Someone took out a credit card in Greg's name and used his address and phone number to validate the card. Within a week, someone tried to use the card to withdraw large amounts of money from a local ATM. The credit card company immediately flagged the card and put a hold on it. When contacted by the credit card company, Greg stated that he did not have a credit card with that bank, and then the police were called. During the investigation, the police interviewed Greg's children and grandchildren. Jolie admitted to having a gambling addiction, which Anna and other family members had also mentioned to the police, but she adamantly denied any role in the identity theft. The district attorney's office spoke at length to Greg, but decided there was not enough evidence to prosecute Jolie. Greg refused to name Jolie as a suspect or to cooperate in any further investigation. The identity theft incident led to a great deal of anger and mistrust among Greg's children and grandchildren. Greg just wants everything to go back to the way it was and everyone to get along again. Communication has become difficult, and emotions are running high.
Does that sound familiar? Any of you have cases like that? You can't really tell what's going on?
Seems like, well,
Grandchildren?
alleged perpetrators.
Yes, so sometimes you're seeing grandchildren as perpetrators. Sound familiar to others? I think it's a pretty common case. When I hear about things that Adult Protective sees, very often you don't have a lot of information. You have a lot of suspicions when you're walking in the first time. People are suspicious that certain things are happening, but you don't really have all of the information until you dive in and do some more. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's dive in and say there's more to the story.
So you have part M, right? You're turning to part M, which we cleverly labeled to go with mediation. So this adds information to the basics of Greg's story, which you've already heard about. So speaking with the family members one-on-one indicates, and you see those bullets there, indicates that most of them agree about several important points. They agree that Jolie has been taking good care of Greg. They really think that Jolie, or the tattoo guy, right, were probably involved with the credit card scam. They also have a sense that Greg may not be staying on top of his finances, although Greg thinks he's fine. And there is a general sense among everybody except Greg and Jolie and a couple of the grandchildren, right, who like to hang out with their friends there, that things need to change. So there's a consensus among this family about several very important aspects of what's going on with Greg. But there are disagreements as well. Greg and his children and grandchildren disagree about Greg's living situation. Should he stay at home or should he go someplace else, like assisted living? Big disagreement there. They also disagree about Jolie's living situation. Should she stay at home? Should she have to find an apartment? Should she be banned from the family home forever? And the POA is another question. Does Greg need one? And if so, who should it be? So you see, this is a very sort of typical scenario presenting to our agency, in the sense that through the process of intake and speaking with each of these people one-on-one, I would have learned the points that are bulleted on your handout, and have started to get the idea that there are really three groups of, there are really sort of three factions that are disagreeing about what happened here. So this case could be referred to mediation by the DA's office because there's, as the facts state, insufficient evidence to prosecute, particularly without Greg's cooperation. It could be referred by APS because Greg doesn't meet their criteria, or another agency or professional. You saw the big list at the beginning of possibles. But let's say this referral comes from Anne, from Greg's daughter Anne, or Anna in this case, because the family is really stuck about what to do next, and they are angry with each other, and they are worried about Greg, and everything's just miserable. So mediation, here's your classic, you have to have a definition, right? So the definition of mediation here illustrates, or would be given to Anna when she called, okay, this is what you're getting into. And I want to highlight a couple points about this definition, and then we'll go into some of the specifics in a minute. But first key, it's a process, okay? It's not a wand waved or otherwise. It's a process. It's about problem solving. Again, it's not about therapy. It's not about figuring out what happened. It's about problem solving. Next, it's facilitated, but then you get to the rest of that definition, which says essentially the parties do the heavy lifting. The mediators facilitate, but the parties do the work. So neutrality, confidentiality, and voluntariness are the three key values of mediation. I want to, just as an aside here about the neutrality piece, I was doing intake on a phone call earlier this year, and I'd been listening to the person's story for quite a while, and she took a deep breath, and I took advantage of the opportunity to use my reflective skills and said, "You sound very frustrated." She took another deep breath and pretty much started shouting at me, "You're supposed to be neutral. You're not supposed to have an opinion about me," because I'm like being, doing active listening and reflective. So I had to figure out on the spot, and I think it's worthwhile to think about what we mean by neutrality, because that's not a term that necessarily is defined uniformly across processes. So what neutrality means in mediation is we're nonpartisan about the individual parties. We're non-judgmental about the party's conduct. That does not mean that we do not require people to behave reasonably while they're in the mediation, right? We keep control of the process, but we don't make judgments, we don't call names, we don't make judgments about what they've done previously. We're not involved in the content of the dispute. We have no skin in the game. And finally, we're not directive about particular solutions. Sarah mentioned that the community members in a peacemaking circle are often solicited for their guidance about what should happen next or what their advice would be. Similarly, people in mediation, parties in a mediation, will ask the mediator or mediators what they would do, and that's when we do, as one of my trainers said, feel the back of your chair and let them, try to help them figure that out. So that's neutrality. Confidentiality, mediators are bound to preserve the confidentiality of all communications related to the mediation, both among participants. So if I'm on the phone with Betsy about a mediation that she's involved in, and then I'm involved with her coworker about Lori about what's going on, obviously I don't share information between the two of them. So we're not just talking about the confidentiality of the mediation process, the mediation session or sessions themselves. Outside the mediation process, we are bound by, as a community dispute resolution center in the state of New York, we are legally bound, statutorily bound, not to provide information to other service providers, including the referring agency. So if Adult Protective Services refers a case to us, we can't have conversation with Adult Protective Services about what's going on. We have gotten to the point where we can say, yes, they contacted us and we're going to do a mediation, but that's as far as it goes. Very early on in my work in this area, I was at the home of a client interviewing the elder. I do all the intake with elders. I do all the intake one-on-one, and I do intake with the elders in person. So I'm at the elder's house, and some of these guys have heard this story before. APS shows up outside. And so as I'm walking out the door, this delightful APS person comes up to me and says, "Oh, are you Alette?" And I was like, "No, I don't know. Excuse me while I put a bag over my head and run to the car, because you're not supposed to know I'm here," So it does get a little awkward sometimes, but we work around it and try to make it practical. But I tell you, I really did not know what to do when she asked me what my name was. Okay, and as we've said, participation and agreement are voluntary here. Okay, hopefully this diagram will give you a sense of the flow of the process. I spoke briefly about intake. Here's where, so the intake process is where we learn the stories, such as the bulleted items in your Part M. We also screen for elder abuse in preparing to do this work in Onondaga County and Cortland and Oswego. I work directly with Jenny to work out the questions that should be included in the intake process to determine whether or not there was reason to suspect that there was a problem with elder abuse. We've also worked with other resources to determine whether or not the person can participate in mediation. Capacity is defined flexibly here, and we take whatever steps we can to make the capacity work for, or maximize the capacity of someone, any of the parties who may be, need some support in that area in terms of time of day, right? Location of the mediation, support people, and so forth. Okay, different color box to emphasize the break between intake and the steps of the mediation session. The threshold question in each case, so having gone through all the intake, the threshold question is this case appropriate for mediation? The mediation process is well suited to disputes about specific issues, as we were saying earlier, situations that can be changed. So you need to have a goal, right? We don't, again, not therapeutic. We don't do a mediation session where the main objective is to let everybody get it off their chest. That's the first part under parties, stories, and concern, but that's not the main objective. And also, do we have parties who are engaged and willing to focus on the future? So those are the three of the things that we try to figure out in making the decision whether or not the case is appropriate for mediation. If we determine it is appropriate, we set up a mediation meeting at the convenience of the parties. It looks like a group of people sitting around a conference room table. It's very non-threatening in terms of looking. Have anybody here ever participated in a mediation? Yeah, so sat around a table, right? I'm overdressed. I dressed up for you guys, but I'm overdressed in terms of running a media, or trying to, I don't run, I facilitate, right, a mediation. So, introduction, the agreement to mediate is formal. On the record, everybody says, we are here to mediate together. We're going to work on this, and this is how we're going to do it. The parties tell their stories one at a time without interruptions. We identify the issues by summarizing what they've told in their stories. So we'll say, okay, what I'm hearing is that you guys are really concerned about where Greg should live. Have we got that right? And so forth. The parties then generate options for dealing with those issues. They brainstorm, they discuss priorities, they use trade-offs, they build consensus, and then they choose solutions that'll work best for their needs and goals. Very specific sometimes about what they're looking for. And then we hope to get to an agreement, which is signed at some point. So the image of the triangular funnel here represents the narrowing of issues and differences during the stages of mediation, but also after the parties, particularly after the parties have had a chance to vent their anger and their distress in the everybody gets to take a turn without being interrupted at the beginning, there is, you can feel it often, a decrease in tension and hostility as the process goes through. So that's another way of using that, that triangle. And all the way through, we model constructive communication, we encourage them to practice it, and so they're picking up skills at the same time. We wouldn't expect a dispute like the one between Greg and his family members that we're talking about to be resolved in a single 2-hour session, but we would think it would be reasonable for the parties to agree about what the next steps are going to be, which might be you're responsible for setting up the next session, right? Who will do what and how they will communicate in the meantime. Okay. These are some of the benefits of mediation, particularly in cases where the adults in a family are in conflict. We find that the parties' participation in the program gives them ownership of what's going on, and that skin in the game that I referred to earlier in terms of how the process goes and what the agreement might be. There is definitely the potential to preserve and repair relationships. Because they have an opportunity to hear about each other's concerns, so they understand each other better. because they have the experience of working together cooperatively with us helping them through that cooperative process. Because the result is something that they can all accept. Of course, lawyers never say never, but it's very rare, let's say, to have a result where everybody's on the same page about everything. But the trade-offs, the compromises, the okay, I can live with that, is what we're trying to get to at the end. And the literature, the research into mediation shows clearly that mediated agreements are more likely to stick in the long run than imposed outcomes. So, Sarah, how about peacemaking for Greg and his family?
So peacemaking has a couple of similar processes to mediation, including the intake process, and how important and instrumental that intake process is to setting the tone as you move the case into the practice. So like I was saying, in the intake process, we talk to each of the parties separately, and we give them as much time as they need to go through that. And so in this scenario, what the intake reveals is the following: that Jolie has stolen from other family members in the past, which is part of what's driving the suspicions. That Anna and her siblings, Anna's her mother, Anna and her siblings are convinced that Jolie is responsible for stealing Greg's identity, that Jolie intercepted the mail with the new credit cards in it and called to activate the cards from the house phone. They're telling Greg not to let Jolie into the house again, including for upcoming family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, parties, things like that. Intake also reveals, when we talk to Greg, that Greg believes that Jolie is responsible, and that he's feeling very overwhelmed by his family and by all of their chatter in his ear about what he needs to do. And he wants to take a minute to reassert that he's in control of this and that he has his own options, that he has his own agency, and that he's not going to be bullied by his adult children. We also learn that he's seeking personal connection and that he's feeling very lonely and isolated despite being surrounded by all these well-meaning family members. And we also learn that he does have a new friendship with a new woman that he hasn't told his adult children about yet. And he is looking for an opportunity to introduce her to everyone, but not in the middle of this mess with Jolie, right? All right. So again, we start with this intake process, and we explain peacemaking to the participants, obviously, and what the process is going to look like. And we ask participants to voluntarily agree to participate. We also ask them to identify support people. Who is it that you connect with? Who's your emotional support? Who's the person you call when you need something? Who's not a party to this case right now? In the cases that we've taken, support people have come from all walks of life. They've included family and friends, which you expect, pastors, significant others, probation officers, case managers, mentors, coaches. We had somebody who identified his volleyball coach. He was in like an adult league, right? He identified his volleyball coach as somebody that he actually felt a personal connection to and who was outside of the scope of this family drama, but who could be a good support for him. And we ask those support people to accompany folks into the peacemaking process. We find that the support people hold the people that they know accountable in different ways. And so what you see is you'll have a mother who's involved, who's talking about like how hard it is being the single mom, and her friend says, yeah, but you're actually taking advantage of your status as a single mom because you get let out of work earlier than everybody else. Ooh, right? I would never be able to call somebody out on their behavior that way. Who am I, right? But when you have your support person there who can ask those questions, be your emotional support, but also be your truth teller, right? When you get that back, it can be really powerful. So we don't take cases where there's intimate partner domestic violence. It's not because we don't think we can. It's because at this point, we don't feel like our community members are adequately trained to take those cases, that it requires a very special type of education, and that we would want a domestic violence case manager to be in all of those circles. Our Native American mentors have told us that they take those cases and that it's an option, but at this point, we have not gone in that direction. And we also don't take cases of gang violence for some of the same exact reasons. And we don't take anyone who's under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which seems obvious, but it's amazing how many people will get so nervous about this process that they show up and they're completely blitzed, right? So you can't come in, you can't do that. Most of our cases are misdemeanor, low-level offenses. And we ask them during the intake process to identify their goals. And then we'd help them try to identify different peacemakers. So we ask them, do you know any of these people who we have? We have 67 trained community members who act as peacemakers. Do you know any of these people? And sometimes they do and they want them on the case, and sometimes they know them and they don't want them on the case, and that's their prerogative. And we try and figure out like who will they relate to and for what reason. So for example, we have a peacemaker who is the bureau chief of parole, right? She's kind of an important person in Onondaga County, and it's amazing how many times people identify her who have a criminal charge because they say, well, she knows what happens on the end. She understands the reentry process, right? And how hard it has been for me to find work, or how hard it has been for me to go to my grandmother's house for Sunday dinner when she's ashamed because I came home from incarceration, right? And so you really don't know who people are going to identify. Usually peacemaking takes 2 to 3 sessions. That's an average. We've had cases go as long as 8 different sessions, and sometimes they resolve within 1. It really depends on where the parties are at when they come into it. Usually, if you're already involved in the criminal justice system about a relationship issue, the first time you got arrested was not the first time this issue was a problem, right? Usually there's been some history that's led up to it, and there are maybe years and years and years, and maybe generations of trauma behind it. I'm going to push this again, and hopefully it's not going to go crazy. There we go. We, again, think about and try to explain to the participants that the people in the room are not the judge and the jury, right? And so you're not trying to convince anybody in the same way that Alette said, like, we're not going to find you guilty of anything. There's no fact-finding involved. We're looking for people to talk about what happened to them and what their experience is, and to get out of their head and into their heart, right? That's easier said than done. We like to describe our peacemakers as being a big heart with 2 ears. There's a saying by the Onondaga Nation, some of our trainers who have said, there's a reason that we have 2 ears but only 1 mouth, right? So be quiet and listen. Listening is a really hard skill, and many of us don't know how to do it well, especially the attorneys who are sitting here on the panel. And so it's always a challenge for us. The coordinator for our program is also a trained attorney, and so she sits on her hands a lot and wants to jump in, and she's got to calm it down. But what we do is we try and really focus people on this idea that this is a process that is, again, participant-driven, and that we're not the criminal justice system, and we're not going to stand in as a substitution for that. And what we're looking at is that the behaviors that brought us to this moment are based on a violation of people and relationships. You have to be invested in some way that you want something better to come out of this. We also want to make them understand that violations create obligations, right? And that we all have obligations in our lives, and sometimes those obligations are pushed forward by things that are outside of our control, right? That we don't want to be responsible for that, but sometimes we got to step up, especially if any of you are in the sandwich generation where you are taking care of an older parent and have young children in the home, right? And that constant struggle of where your attention goes. And so we see a lot of that in cases where people are really struggling with trying to understand how they got stuck with all these obligations that they didn't sign up for, right? And to take some of that anger and place it someplace else, but not back at the person, particularly the parent or your children. And then we want to understand, again, that justice involves many, many, many different people. And it involves other stakeholders, sometimes community supports, like case managers or social workers or mental health therapists. Like, there's a role for them in this too, even though it's not a substitution for that. Like Alette said, we are not family therapy but we get a lot of cases for people who refuse to go to therapy, to family therapy. They don't want to go. We get a lot of cases of people who don't want to go to domestic violence counseling. We see our role in this is to get them to the place where they're ready to make that step, where we can make that referral and they'll say, okay, I'm ready to go. And mostly it's because people are afraid. They don't know what's going to happen, or they have this idea that, oh, I've heard that if I call the domestic violence hotline, this is what's going to happen, even though, that's one anecdote that they heard from a neighbor or something like that. So we use this tree as our image, and so how we try and identify what's going on for people is that at the bottom it says shared values and indigenous teachings. And so what we've been told and how we think about our practice is that half of the time that people are working together on these relationships, we have to spend down here. Like, half of every circle needs to be talking about what do we share in common and why is this relationship worth saving, right? And how do we even hold people accountable if our idea of what's right and wrong is different? So as humans, we always want to get to the top, right? We want to be up in the leaves as quickly as possible. And so what it says up there, it says community, connection, healing, and collective action. And so what people think about restorative practices is, oh, I'm going to sit in this circle for an hour, I'm going to cry, I'm going to walk out, and everything is going to be fine, right? I'm going to get to that tree really quickly. And that almost never happens, right? You have to set those expectations aside, and you have to do the real work of trying to figure out why this relationship is worth working on. Why does it even matter? Why don't we just walk our separate ways? One of my very favorite cases that we had was between two older women who had been living in a duplex, upstairs, downstairs neighbors, for almost 15 years. And both of them lived alone, and both of them were over 60. One of them, I believe, was around 67, 68, and one was a little older, 75, 76. And they had called the police 300 times in 2 months about things like, you scraped your dining room table on the floor and I could hear it, and that was obnoxious, so I'm calling the police. It was things like they had a shared driveway with another neighbor, and the neighbor was plowing for them the snow, and they wanted to be responsible for the snow removal, but then they got into a fight with themselves about who was going to be responsible for this, right? This was 15 years worth of anger and resentment and grumpy behavior, right? And the police department called us and said, you have to do something with these women because we do not want to arrest either of them, right? But they are taking all of our resources. We have actual things to do, right? Besides have 911 calls come in 300 times to this one residence. And so it was a really good example of bringing these women together and saying, why is it even worth working on this relationship? Because they both received Section 8 and they couldn't go anywhere else. Where are you going to go? Are you going to move when you're 75? Right? Because their fear is if I move, it's not going to work out, and then I'm going into assisted living, right? And none of my family wants me. I can't live with my kids. They're not around, right? The whole deal. Like, you've heard these stories before, or what people's fears are. Okay, so then we're invested in this, and we're invested in it enough that we got to make sure that the police don't have to keep coming back to your house all the time, right? And what was really great is that one of the police officers, who's the community police officer, right? So they're not the beat cops, right? They're the people who work on these sort of low-level crimes. He sat in the circle with them and explained to them all the resources that go into being called for a 911 call. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of paperwork. In the city of Syracuse, you have to send at least 2 officers for every 911 call. So that's pulling 2 officers off the street every single time you call because you're mad that your neighbor plowed the driveway, right? So what we're trying to do is hold these women accountable for their behavior and say, listen, you got to cut it out. You got to stop, right? But at the same time, what's worth saving about the case? So the trunk of the tree, is what we use as our framework for a peacemaking circle. So we start every circle with a ceremony. Sometimes they're religious and sometimes not. It's based on the background of the individuals who participate. We use a talking piece, so you can't talk unless you're the one holding the talking piece. Kids are really good at this because they get told to be quiet all the time. Adults are really bad at this because they think they can interrupt children. So that's just what I've seen. We go over guidelines. That's part of those shared values. So we do some exercises where we set rules about what can and can't be done. It's amazing how many people are quick to say, yes, cell phones are not allowed, and then they sit there for an hour and a half, and oh, it's really hard, right? Suddenly that guideline, oh, it's very difficult. So we put those guidelines in place for a reason. Again, we talk about consensus. How do we get to consensus? What does consensus look like? And then we talk about keeping the circle, right? And so that's this idea of what happens in the circle stays in the circle, this confidentiality. There's a ceremony that starts it and a ceremony that ends it. We also break bread. We eat before every single circle because human nature enjoys the process of eating with each other, and people, like, the levels of stress definitely decrease. And so that's how that works. We walk out of every circle with healing steps. What we've identified is what people are going to work on either between this session and the next session or forevermore, what our long-term healing steps are. And these healing steps have to be identified by the participants. They're not identified by the peacemakers or the facilitators. My very favorite healing step that I ever witnessed was a young girl who was in 5th grade. Her parents were in a child custody dispute. They were not really paying very much attention to her. And as it happens in custody disputes, right, they were very much focused on themselves and how angry they were. And when we got to the healing steps and everybody was identifying what they were going to do between now and the next session, she said, and she was in summer school, she said, I am not going to stab anyone with my pencil between now and next week. And we all looked at her like, I'm sorry, what? Stabbing people with a pencil is not acceptable, not when you're a 5th grader. That's a 10-year-old, 10 or 11-year-old, right? And so, but she had been taking all of this and holding it, and she was lashing out at her classmates, and nobody had any idea. So she identified that as her healing step. The next week when we came back and everybody was doing their check-in, what did she say? I didn't stab one person with my pencil this week. That is a win, right? That is a kid who is not getting in trouble at summer school for her behavior, which is predicated on the behavior of her parents, right? So that's the kind of thing we do. That's why it's self-directed. I would never know to say to somebody, don't stab people with a pencil, right? That's not the kind of thing that I know. And then what we also do as we move the case towards the consensus, towards the final one, is we do check-ins and one-on-ones with people if they need it. So sometimes what will happen is, and the 2 older women I talked about is a good example. They were having this argument together. It turned out that one of the women was also in a huge child custody dispute with her daughter because she was raising his son, or her daughter's son, and the daughter now wanted custody back. And so there was other stuff going on that influenced the case that we had already. But instead, what we were able to do is to take her aside and to start sort of like a new circle, because the neighbor didn't need to know about all that. It wasn't any of her business. So that's a little bit about how how Greg's case would work in a peacemaking circle. There you go.
So now we're to the point of the panel discussion and the question and answer time. We've covered a lot of the background behind when is the criminal justice system, when does that fit well, when might peacemaking fit, when might mediation fit. What I'd ask is if you raise your hand, we have a microphone for you to ask your question, and then we'll turn it over to the panel for some answers. So does anyone have a question that they want to talk about?
Yes, can you tell me what are the expenses and who would be responsible for paying on both the peacemaking and mediation?
Sure. You want to go first?
Sure. So our project is covered by both county money and New York State Health Foundation money. So right now we are able to offer services free of charge to anybody who wants it.
The Community Dispute Resolution Center program is funded, sort of, by New York State. We do not have a separate grant for the Elder Transitions Mediation Program, so we have a sliding scale fee that ranges from 0 if your income is $9,000 or less per year, to $100 if your income is $80,000 a year or more. And that $100 for you, if you make $80,000 a year or more, covers all of the intake, all of the preparation, and the first 2-hour session. So it's we hope, a modest cost.
Other questions? Okay, then I'm going to ask one for you. I think when I hear people who are hesitant to think about utilizing these processes, there's a fear about accountability. How are these perpetrators, when we're working with them, how are these bad guys being held accountable in these processes? So I'd like to turn that over to the panel and just talk about, how do you view accountability?
You want to? Do you guys want it? No. So Sarah spoke to the limits of the types of cases that would be acceptable for peacemaking. The only case that we would consider for mediation, and you recall, please, the comprehensive intake system process, right? And is this an appropriate case for mediation, would clearly include an evaluation or a conclusion that everybody would be safe and we would be able to control the process. We would only consider taking a case that had aspects of abuse if the abuse was limited to financial abuse. I have been so well taught by my colleagues at Vera House that I know that financial abuse is often just what's showing, and that there are other types of abuse going on. We used the EASY, the Elder Abuse
Suspicion
Index questions to evaluate whether or not there's any indication of abuse, and if there is, we stop and back up and get more information. The part of the screening process includes a question about whether Adult Protective Services has ever been engaged with the family, and if the answer to that is yes, we have special dispensation to expand the confidentiality understanding to contact the Director of Adult Protective Services in Onondaga County, who works for Barry. And what I say to her is, we've got this case, they say they've been through APS, is there any reason you think this would not be safe for us to do? And if she says, well, then that's it, we don't do that. So we're not, that obviously limits our ability to participate, to try to address situations where there has been or maybe financial exploitation, but that's our commitment to safety of the process and especially of the individuals. Mm-hmm. You want to?
I think I would only add that in the intake process, we ask some similar questions about whether or not Child Protective Services or Adult Protective Services are aware of this, of what's going on, and how they would not be involved. Because sometimes what happens is people will call us and say, hey, you're interfering with our treatment, right? Or our treatment plan or something like that. And if that's the case, then we are going to step out really quickly. And that's happened a couple of times. Because again, people's lives are very complicated, and they're not going to tell you everything on an intake, but sometimes you begin to get new information from people, and that's been the case with CPS and APS workers. And so we're also mandated reporters, and of course, we're mandated reporters for child abuse cases, but within our office, we have an elder abuse policy to be mandated reporters for elder abuse. So that's one thing that we've been made aware of by our relationship with Vera House, that we want to be very delicate about these cases. We also don't want to harm people more, right? The whole point is to heal people, not to make it worse in any way. And so as soon as it feels like we're getting close to that, we definitely put a pause on the case. We have had one person who threatened to commit suicide during a session. And it was shocking how it was it was just like she finally got the talking piece and said, I think I'm going to kill myself. Like, oh my goodness, right? We stopped everything right then, and we have a local hotline, and so we first called the local hotline, and then they referred us to the state hotline, and then we walked through it with them on speakerphone with the peacemakers and the participant. Everybody else had left, and I was really impressed at how the hotline handled the case and how they did the follow through, and like what we were able to do to make sure that the person had a safety plan and that they didn't leave before that safety plan was in place, and they had a family member who came and picked them up, right? It was like very complicated and very comprehensive, and I was extremely impressed with the professionalism of the suicide hotline.
Go ahead.
In terms of accountability for purposes of the criminal justice system, it's a little bit more clear cut. Obviously, it's the stuff that you're already familiar with. It's the accusation. If somebody either pleads guilty or is found guilty, there's a piece of accountability just by virtue of the conviction, and then there's obviously the sentencing piece. Again, all of this has to be consistent with the ends of justice. So both the level of the crime that the person is accused of, the conviction that we're seeking, and also the sentence has to essentially be fair. What we can't do entirely, and there are some creative ways of doing it, but we can't force somebody to go to mediation, or we can't force somebody to be sorry or feel sorry or give something like what Sarah was saying, give a good apology. We have done that in some cases where we've considered apologies or considered basically taking responsibility as an equity in the case. So particularly for younger individuals, we do this with, we have an adolescent diversion part. We do it with younger people where they have to write a letter of apology. There's not a whole lot of oversight in terms of saying like, okay, well, it's got to be a good one. So it really varies, but we try to take it all into account and kind of do a good job of capturing that and making sure that we're holding offenders accountable, but also making sure that if the victim wants that we're doing the best we can to get it.
Great, thank you.
Can I back up
Yes.
and just
Yep.
add to that? So I want to remind us of where we started with this, which was the reason that one of the reasons that we come into play here is because these are cases that Melanie can't take, right, or can't prosecute. These are cases that Barry that APS has gone as far as they can go with. And so we're providing a resource that otherwise would not be available to these families. That is some mechanism for trying to come to an understanding of where the family is and what needs to happen and what harms have been experienced and so forth. So clearly, none of us is suggesting that this is a substitute for for law enforcement or adult protective services. We want to help when we can, when those resources are, when there's a limit to how far they can go.
But I think, I do, but I think that sometimes it is, I know that you get referrals from our office sometimes, so I think that sometimes those processes can work hand in hand. Or if it's a case where we might say, okay, this is not maybe appropriate for a criminal conviction, but why don't we encourage you to go through this process? Again, we can sometimes consider their success and progress through these or through these processes as an equity in the disposition in our case. So it really, it depends on the severity of the offense that we're looking at, whether it's something that we would refer and we would say, okay, this might be a good option. So I don't think it's exclusive. It's not one or the other.
And we also make referrals to the DA's office. Right. So sometimes we'll get a case through law enforcement, right, and it'll be pre-arrest. And then during the case, you learn about a serious crime that's been committed, for example, against a child. Like, all right, well, we're going to talk about what your next steps are. And I think that this is not going to be appropriate for us to move forward on. We think that you should call the police and we should move forward, or we should go to our child advocacy center and make a statement or something like that. And so we have relationships with folks on the other side. So I don't want it to seem like, everything's just filtering through, and we're like kind of like scooping up the remains, right? It's more of an organic process where it goes back, and the same thing with APS, right? If we become aware of an issue and we talk to the participant and say, I think that APS is going to be your next best hope at this point, because you're not going to get the accountability you want, and so we think that you should call, and we can make that call with you, right? We can go with you. That might be what happens next.
Okay, thank you. There's really not enough time for another question, but I would like to just ask a question of the audience by raising hands. How many of you, this is the first time you've heard about things like peacemaking and mediation? Okay, thank you. And can you see this being useful as a tool that may not exist today? Is that something you think that you would utilize or could see use for? Thank you. It's something new, and I think it's something we'd like to look at as an alternative, as another option for people who might be facing some of these really tough situations. If you have any other questions, there is a handout with contact information about all of the speakers, or if you want to come up afterwards and share any other thoughts or provide comments, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you all for your time.